The moment has finally come. I have been waiting for the perfect opportunity for so long, chaining and restraining this beast inside of me that could have broken out at the slightest slip-up. But I no longer have to hold back. The beast has finally been released. Mehmet, activate the Turkish nationalist sleeper cells within my audience.
We'll be safe and sound.
A couple of months ago, this little chuddy of yours finally latched onto his latest early 20th century autistic fixation. I'd already burned through my German Empire phase and speedran Austria-Hungary, so naturally the wheel of fate spun and landed on the next Central Powers contestant, the Ottoman Empire. For the past 2 months or so, I'd casually drop a fact or two on my Twitter timeline, just harmless little knowledge crumbs. Unsurprisingly, this sent the Greek nationalists in my mentions into a mild existential crisis. What shocked me even more was discovering that I apparently had a sizable Greek nationalist audience at all, which was news to both me and my therapist. Then came the big question. What kind of video do I even want to make with this? I didn't want to hoard all this shiny new information for myself, but I also didn't feel like nuking my channel audience by saying anything even mildly complimentary about the Turks. And that's when it happened. A cursed little idea began rattling around in my brain. I tried to shove it down instantly, the same way you bury that childhood memory of Uncle Cletus coming into your room one night. But it was too late. Against my will, against my peace, and against basic self-preservation, it clawed its way to the surface and took over my thoughts with the relentless force of religion steamrolling C.S. Lewis's disbelief. Unfortunately, the idea I was trying to suppress involved revisiting a creator who, last time, sent me into a full public meltdown in glorious 4K. The psychological damage was so intense it felt like my remaining brain cells filed a class action lawsuit and rushed themselves to the ER. Yes, I'm talking about Henry Stewart History. The last time we crossed paths, he was confidently explaining how Austria-Hungary was apparently useless in World War I, using arguments that will make even the most baseline military history enjoyer blink twice and reassess reality. And by a truly miraculous coincidence, he has now made the exact same style of video, but this time aimed squarely at the Ottoman Empire. Since you all seem to enjoy my descent into military history madness with the Austrian one, I figured I'd take the hit and check this one out for you. If you really think about it, the Ottoman theater barely gets any airtime compared to the European fronts, and when it does show up, it's rarely to hand out compliments to the Ottomans. So I figured I'd step in and offer some much needed context on a few aspects of the Ottoman theater and the Ottoman army, if only to finally bury a couple of stubborn misconceptions once and for all. Much like the Austrian video, I'll be making the dangerously controversial argument that the Ottomans were not the irredeemable disaster they're so often painted as. Thankfully, I've secured a fresh brain donor for this one, so I am better prepared than last time. With that out of the way, let's see what our old pal Henry Slopworth has lined up for us. But just before that, I have some very exciting news to share with all of you. I will be one of the official speakers at the second Karlstag event in Germany, which will take place in late April. I was honored to be one of the speakers at the first Karlstage earlier this year, so I am very happy to return. Karlstage is an unprecedented, right-leaning academic conference where the problems we are faced with can be discussed. Some of the other prominent speakers at the event include Edward Dutton, or as you may know him as the Jolly Heretic, prominent German YouTuber Schattenmacher, as well as a few others. The event as I have already said, will take place in Germany. Despite taking place there, all of the talks and events will be held in English, so you do not have to worry about a language barrier. The event will take place from the 24th to the 26th of April 2026. And to make things more exciting, Karlstage always makes sure to pick out luxurious locations. Last time we had a full castle. If you are interested or want more information, you can go to the Karlstage website I will link down below in the description. Go ahead and book your ticket, and I am sure all of us will have a good time, and I am very excited to meet some of you in person. Had a blast talking to a few of you in person last time. Anyway, let us officially start with the response.
The First World War is almost always thought of as a war against Germany, and to a lesser extent Austria-Hungary. It's easy to forget that there was a third empire that participated on their side, the Ottoman Empire. That is because, by that point in its life, the Ottoman Empire was on its last legs and wasn't able to contribute much to the war effort. In fact, their military performance on the battlefield was extremely poor. The Ottoman military was outdated, poorly equipped and poorly led. In one battle, tens of thousands of Ottoman troops ended up freezing to death because they hadn't been given the winter clothing that they needed. The war would turn out to be a disaster for the Ottomans. They lost a huge amount of territory, and after the war was over, they would see their empire taken apart by the victors. So, why was the Ottoman military so ineffective in World War I? Why couldn't the once mighty empire take advantage of its strategic position between the Balkans and the Middle East to help its allies win the war? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions. But first, let's have an overview of how it happened. The story of the Ottoman Empire in World War I.
From the very get-go, we need to make something abundantly clear. If you want to say that the Ottomans were ineffective, that they failed, were useless and whatnot, you need to first understand and know what the Ottoman objective in the war was, and determine whether that objective was achieved or not, and to what extent. So, what was it? Very simple actually. The goal of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War was to tie up as many British and French forces as possible in the Middle East, forcing them to direct more men and equipment to their front, which would have otherwise gone to the main ones like the Western one. And the same went for Russia in the Caucasus. When offensives were planned and executed, it was more about causing as many casualties and material damage as possible, and land gains themselves were secondary. If an offensive failed and the Ottomans didn't manage to make any land gains, but still inflicted heavy casualties and material losses, they would have still achieved their objective. One might say that this just makes the Ottoman Empire cannon fodder, and in a way, yeah, I can see that, but I would argue that they still played an important role in the war, even if it was a sideshow. Preventing more men and equipment from arriving at the main enemy front is a genuine strategy and objective, not to mention the fact that there was still something in it for them. If the Central Powers won the war, they would have also greatly benefited in terms of territorial gains, so it's not like all those losses they suffered would have been for nothing. And it is very important to keep this in mind. Unfortunately, as we have seen in the Austrian video, Mr. Slopworth's criteria for success is quite literally based on Hoi 4 logic, how much enemy land you can take and hold.
Now, to understand the situation that the Ottomans were in, we need to take a closer look at the geography of their empire and the fronts that they had to defend. The first front was the Balkans, where the priority was protecting Istanbul, the empire's capital. The second was the Caucasus Mountains, where the Ottoman Empire shared a large border with Russia. That front actually became one of the most active of the entire war, with large amounts of territory regularly changing hands. The biggest challenge would be to defend their territory in the Middle East. There they would have to defend against British forces invading from numerous directions, including Egypt and modern-day Iraq and Yemen. In total, the Ottomans had to defend 12,000 kilometers of borders and coastlines, spanning the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean. It was an immense challenge, and even more so for an empire so weak that it was known as the sick man of Europe.
The map he showed on screen is, let's just say, it's a bit misleading. You see all this blue on the map supposed to show the holdings of Britain? Most of this is just theoretical control, not actual. Like in Yemen, he shows like half of it under British control, when in reality they only held like a few ports here and there, maybe a town or two, with a border that was barely even defended. Most of this is not how it would have looked like on a practical scale. The only places the Ottomans had to worry about was Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, and the area of modern-day Kuwait. Like, there was barely any, maybe only tiny small skirmishes in Yemen, but that's about it. If you look at Hejaz, where Medina and Mecca are, throughout the entire war, there were no landings there. Naval invasions weren't an issue on the Red Sea, because that area completely lacked any potential in terms of logistics and infrastructure. There was only one railway going through Medina and Mecca, and that was it, with only a few scattered Bedouin tribes here and there. The only front that took place in that area was when the Arab Revolt happened, but on their own, the British could not just do anything there. Again, Egypt and Kuwait were their only fronts, and everything else was just theoretical control. Like when you look at the map of Italian Libya, you see how the entire region was under their control, when in reality, the Italians had official control only in a few towns here and there, and the rest was de jure. Like again, this isn't Hoi 4, you don't need to defend and garrison every shitty little plot of land.
At the same time, the Ottomans faced an invasion from Russia in the Caucasus. Initially, they managed to hold their ground against the Russian advance. However, they then tried to counterattack, and that turned into a disaster. At the Battle of Sarai Kamish, an Ottoman army of roughly 100,000 men tried to encircle the invading Russian forces. It was totally overambitious, far beyond the scope of the Ottoman military. In the end, the entire force was decimated, with over 80% of the men either killed, injured, or captured.
Casualties on the Caucasian front were horrific, like an actual nightmare, but the Ottoman Third Army did not get its size cut down by 80%. So, as it goes, the Third Army had about 100,000 men, and after the disastrous offensive, it suffered 80 to 90,000 casualties, which is pretty jaw-dropping. But this number isn't actually accurate. You see, this number comes from the French historian Maurice Larcher and his 1926 book about the Ottoman Empire in World War I, which was one of the first to be written on this theater in the West. But since Ottoman military archives weren't open at the time, he mostly went off of Entente, i.e. Russian estimates, and his numbers are still frequently cited in books about the Ottomans. Fortunately for us, we do actually have concrete numbers and operational returns compiled by Lieutenant Colonel Felix Goose, who was the chief of the general staff of the Ottoman Third Army. And in his report, he specifies that the casualty rate was 30,000, with 7,000 captured. Of course, that casualty rate is still pretty bad, but definitely nowhere near the 80 to 90,000 number frequently given today. Just goes to show how hard it is to uproot a misconception when it manages to properly plant itself, even with the truth out there. And you want to know something funny? The plan to encircle the Russians was almost a success. The offensive was ambitious but very well planned, and had it not been for the Russians pulling soldiers off the Erzurum line at the absolute last moment to garrison Shirikamish, the army would have been encircled. Author Edward J. Erickson, in his work, Ordered to Die, which is pretty much one of the best books on the Ottoman military available in the English language, had this to say. Quote, "The Turkish plan went off as scheduled and remained very much on track until December 28, 1914, when the Russians managed to pull several infantry and cavalry regiments off the Erzurum line in time to rush these units northwards to garrison the city of Shirikamish. This timely Russian reaction was probably the most important reason that the Turkish plan failed. Absent strong Russian forces in and around Shirikamish on December 28th, the city would have undoubtedly fallen to the Turkish Ninth Corps. The fact that the Turkish envelopment came within a hair's breadth of snapping shut as planned validates their basic operational concept." Yeah, it was a failure in the end, and the army did suffer serious casualties, but I do think it needs to be mentioned that the offensive failed more so due to the Russians responding on time rather than any inherent flaws in the Ottoman war plans, and the fact that they almost achieved this without wearing any winter clothes is even more impressive.
Meanwhile, in Palestine and Egypt, the Ottomans actually went on the offensive. They tried to seize the strategically vital Suez Canal from the British, but the campaign was poorly planned and ended in utter failure.
Poorly planned, you can say the first Suez expedition failed, but it definitely wasn't poorly planned. You think you can just transfer 20,000 men across the Sinai Peninsula with no water anywhere nearby with very poor planning? That feat alone was a giant logistical success, and the British were actually shocked when they realized the Ottomans managed to get that many men across the Sinai. Now, as for the objective of the expedition, it was to damage or disable the Suez Canal for the Entente. Outright capturing the entire canal would have been the best and most favorable outcome. Otherwise, even if you controlled one side of the canal, you could still do plenty of damage and it would have been too risky to continue sending ships through as usual. And in fact, the Ottomans did manage to inflict some naval damage during the expedition, most notably critically damaging the British HMS Harding, although at the time they didn't have enough howitzers to inflict more serious damage, and heavy weapons were on the way to be supplied when the army captured the side of the canal. Now, as for why the expedition failed, by that point, reaching the side of the canal and inflicting as much damage as they could with the equipment they had was going as planned. The big part of it involved crossing to the other side and then holding it. This was to be achieved during a nighttime attack. They would start building makeshift bridges in the evening when the sun had fully set, and then by dawn the next morning, Ottoman troops would have been on the other side, disabling the British machine guns. That was the plan. But then the biggest fun police of all time decided to step in, Mother Nature. I will let historian Sean McMeekin explain what happened in his book The Ottoman Endgame. Quote, "A vicious sandstorm descended on the canal area that evening, forcing General Kressenstein to postpone his attack 5 hours from the original launch time of 10:30 p.m. at 3:30 a.m. on February 3rd. The first column of Turkish troops began laying steel pontoons across the Suez Canal. By dawn, 3 of the bridging columns, amounting to about 2 Ottoman companies, had succeeded in crossing to the western side of the Suez Canal at Tosum and Ismailia, although it was a Pyrrhic victory, for the early morning light now exposed them to murderous British machine gun fire. The shooting, one British officer put it a bit cruelly, resembled a grouse drive. And the battle was pretty much over before it even began, with Ottoman casualties totaling 1.4k, and by that evening the army ordered a retreat from the canal. The expedition was a failure, all because of one damn sandstorm. You might be asking why I bothered to explain the details of why an offensive did not work, considering that they still lost in the end. But in this case, it is very important. If you just want to go over which battles the Ottomans won or lost, sure, go ahead. But when you are telling them as part of a thesis, like that the Ottoman army was ineffective and useless, you need to go over the specifics instead of just herder they failed. There is a difference between a failure that came about due to unexpected circumstances, like our sandstorm, or a proper enemy response, and a failure that came about due to some inherent structural or planning failures. Just because the top 2 chess players in the world played a game and one of them lost, doesn't mean that the guy who lost is inherently bad at chess and can't play. Because if we try to go by the rules of who won and who lost, a lot of people we consider military geniuses would be called incompetent today. Napoleon, Hannibal, Rommel, Robert E. Lee, you get what I'm saying. So when you want to make a point like the Ottomans were useless and incompetent, you better go into the specifics and explain why that battle supports your thesis, and not just say that they lost.
Within 2 months of entering the war, the Ottomans were losing on all fronts. Britain, France and Russia took that as a signal that they might be about to collapse very fast and decided to strike at the empire's heart, Istanbul. Vulnerable from the blockade and with outdated fortifications, Istanbul seemed like an achievable target. That led to the Gallipoli campaign, one of the most infamous battles of the war. The Gallipoli campaign started in early 1915 when the Allies launched a naval assault on the Dardanelles Strait, hoping to force their way to Istanbul. However, the Ottoman mines and artillery inflicted heavy losses, forcing the Allies to abandon their ships and switch to a land invasion.
No, that's not... This is supposed to be a video about the Ottomans, but it looks like I'm gonna have to switch to Team Britain here for a moment. A land invasion at the Dardanelles was always the plan. Trying to send the ships in first would be a literal suicide mission. If you look at the Dardanelles Strait, you will see that it is extremely tight, and it would have given Ottoman defenses, placed on both land sides, the perfect opportunity to do a 20th century version of the Cutler-Beckett death scene. Only an absolute moron would try sending in the ships first just like that. The British were not idiots. A land invasion was always the plan. Secure the sides first and then have the ships enter the strait.
On April the 25th, Allied troops landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula expecting a swift victory. Instead, they encountered fierce Ottoman resistance and the campaign devolved into grueling trench warfare. The fight became a bloody stalemate with immense losses on both sides. Eventually, after about 8 months, the Allies decided to withdraw.
I absolutely love the wording there. So, when the Ottomans lose a battle, it's a complete failure, they could not win, blah blah blah. But when the British fail, he goes, oh no, they didn't lose, they just failed to win. It was a bloody stalemate, heavy losses on both sides, and then the Allies decided to withdraw. It's not that they had to withdraw because it became clear the Dardanelles thing wasn't going to work out. They just, decided to withdraw. It was very sunny, perhaps a little vacation on one of the Greek islands. God bless the Anglos and their narrative framing.
At the same time, the Ottomans faced serious problems in the Middle East. They were challenged not only by outside enemies, but also from rebellions within. The biggest rebellion was the Arab Revolt, which happened because many Arabs were unhappy with Ottoman rule and wanted independence. In June of 1916, Sheriff Hussein of Mecca, an important Arab leader, openly opposed the Ottomans and called for independence. The British saw in the revolt an opportunity to weaken the Ottomans. They promised to support the Arabs and hinted at granting them independence if they joined their side in the war. A key figure in that was T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia. He worked to bring different Arab groups together and organized guerrilla warfare against the Ottomans. For the already struggling Ottomans, the entrance of the Arabs into the war was the last thing they needed.
Alrighty, the Arab Revolt. This is gonna be a fun one. The revolt is probably one of, if not the most mythologized campaign of the First World War. In many ways, the story of T. Lawrence is remarkable. Here you have a man, a British man, who goes into this alien Arab Bedouin culture, managing to pretty much become one of them, and not only that, but unite all these different tribes under one banner and idea against the Ottoman menace. It's a story straight out of a fantasy book, and it's no wonder his story is so widely known. From the absolutely masterful 1962 movie everyone and their grandma watched at least once, to the absolutely amazing campaign in Battlefield 1, where you raid the Ottoman railway and take down a literal war train. Yeah, I played Battlefield 1 as a kid, how can you tell? But the actual unfiltered truth about the Arab Revolt is, a little underwhelming. And when I read about it in the history books, my reaction was basically...
That's it?
The Arab Revolt was at best, at the actual very best, a nuisance, not exactly a very serious threat. Of course, the main target of T. Lawrence and the tribes was the Hejaz Railway. If the Arabs managed to cut it off, or at the very least seriously damage it, then there would have been something in the Arab Revolt after all. But nope. Throughout 1916, 1917, and most of 1918, the Arabs failed at this objective, and the railway remained firmly under Ottoman control, and the guerrilla hit-and-run tactics by Lawrence tended to be hit or miss. And when they did manage to damage the railway in some way, the Turks quickly managed to patch it back up. And while Mecca was lost to the Arabs, Medina was of a far more strategic importance, and the 3,000 Ottoman garrison at the city, brilliantly led and defended by Fakhreddin Pasha, managed to hold out against the Arabs for 3 whole years until January 1919. The Siege of Medina is an extremely fascinating chapter of the Ottoman theater, and it pains me that it's barely spoken of. But to be fair to the Arabs, from the very beginning, they were waiting for a cavalry that pretty much never arrived. The hope was that after Hussein of Mecca publicly denounced the Ottoman Empire and accused them of straying away from true Islamic values by integrating Turkish nationalism into government policy, that it would cause mass Arab mutinies and desertions within the army, strengthening the Arab ranks manpower-wise and maybe even give it a more professional face if enough Arab officers deserted. But yeah, those mass desertions never really came. As McMeekin writes on this, quote, "As propaganda, it was well conceived. Hussein's charges of impiety against the young Turk regime was largely true, and they easily gave the lie to the regime's own holy war propaganda. And yet his summons fell flat, if we are to judge by the fact that not a single Arab unit in the Ottoman armies defected to the British side intact, nor more than a small handful of officers. Like the Ottoman Holy War, Hussein's own Holy War failed to ignite." Compared to the Caucasus front against the Russians, as well as the British fronts in Egypt and Kuwait, the Arab Revolt was considered a relatively minor military concern. At least if we are talking about 1916, 1917, until like mid-1918. Because it's really mostly after that the Arab Revolt snowballed into something bigger, coinciding with the general decline of the Central Powers. The only real long-term impact the revolt did have was shattering the image of Islamic unity on the world stage, since the Ottomans were also the caliphs. It sort of delegitimized the empire in a religious sense.
The war continued to go badly for them. In August of 1916, another attempt to seize the Suez Canal in Egypt ended in failure. British control of the canal wouldn't be challenged again throughout the war. By early 1917, a series of small but decisive battles had pushed the Ottomans back from the Sinai Peninsula, with the British forces reaching Gaza in March of 1917. The Ottomans fought hard and were able to defend Gaza for several months. Eventually, in November, the British heavily bombarded the ancient city and were able to capture it. That victory paved the way for the capture of Jerusalem, which fell just a few weeks later.
What he doesn't mention is the fact of how damn costly the conquest of Gaza was for the British. Actually, costly is a big understatement. In fact, there were 3 separate battles for Gaza. The British failed to take the city the first 2 times and finally managed to do it on the 3rd. All you have to do is look at the casualty rate for all 3 battles. If we group them all together, British casualties amounted to almost 15,000, while the Ottoman casualty rate was under 5,000. Like, words can't explain how fucking ferociously the Turks were defending the city. And you wanna know what makes this better? The British didn't eventually manage to conquer Gaza at the 3rd battle by just fighting the Turks in the streets like in the last 2. No, the British literally said fuck it and obliterated, and quite literally I mean, annihilated the entire city in what was at the time the worst and most destructive bombardment the Middle East had seen in the last 500 years. And it was even the first time in the Middle Eastern theater that the British utilized gas attacks. That's why on the Wikipedia page of the 3rd battle, among the casualties for the Ottomans, it has to specifically emphasize that they were buried under the rubble. The fact that the Ottomans stand at Gaza stumped the British so hard that they had to turn to the war equivalent of cheat codes really says something. I think I know where the modern day IDF got its war doctrine from. Like, this is absurd to me. You know for a fact if it was the Ottomans on the receiving end of such a brutal battle, he would most definitely emphasize more how costly it was and whatnot. While for the British here, he says absolutely nothing, just that the Ottomans fought hard. Again, God bless Anglo history, people. Another aspect he completely neglects to mention. There is a good reason why the British performed as well as they did against the Turks. It was because they had one thing on their side which the Ottomans had absolutely no effective way of countering at all: reconnaissance planes. The British knew pretty much everything there was to know about Ottoman positions, troop numbers, equipment, openings, everything. Because as it turns out, anything that isn't the color of piss in the desert will stand out like a sore thumb when you are high up in the air. And except for a couple of caves here and there, it was literally impossible for them to try and conceal basically anything cause, you know, you are in a wide fucking desert. They didn't have a proper air force unlike, for example, Germany, and they only started getting AA weaponry in late 1917, but even these were few in numbers and, just like with other heavy weaponry, extremely challenging to transport to the front lines. So when British reconnaissance planes did fly overhead, they basically could do nothing much other than just stare up in the sky. You can't really fault them for that. And FYI, a big reason why the battles of Gaza were so bloody and costly for the British was because the Ottoman army utilized the buildings around Gaza to conceal itself a bit, so the planes didn't manage to pick up on everything, and the British fought without being completely aware of what they were getting into.
So, that is what happened. The total defeat and destruction of the Ottoman Empire. So is it really fair to say that they were useless? Did they really perform that badly? Well, to be fair, the Ottomans did actually perform better than many people were expecting when the war started. Many of the great powers, both allies and enemies, expected that they would collapse almost immediately. In reality, the Ottoman Empire did actually achieve a few respectable victories. It wasn't a total pushover. Their biggest victory was, of course, during the Gallipoli campaign, when they were able to badly humiliate the British. Another success was at the First Siege of Kut, where they were able to capture tens of thousands of British soldiers. That said, it's important to remember that they were fighting against enemies that were primarily focused on other theatres of the war. The British were pouring almost all of their resources into the war in France, while the Russians were focused on the fight against Germany and Austria-Hungary. If those two had prioritized the Ottoman front as much as the Ottomans did, the empire would probably have been knocked out within weeks.
I don't understand this argument at all. Yeah, the Ottomans on their own would not have been able to defeat Britain, France, or Russia. They would have been crushed mercilessly. That's just an objective fact. The Ottomans could not stand against these nations on their own. But that's not what we are discussing here. We are discussing the actual state of the war and what they found themselves in. They were a partner in an alliance, and they had their own role to play. There is a good reason why the Ottoman theater was mainly a distraction for the Entente. Again, this point is so stupid.
So why were the Ottomans so much weaker than the other powers in World War I? Well, the first thing to mention is that the empire as a whole was far less advanced than some of the other European nations of the time. It was effectively stuck in the 1800s, having fallen far behind other nations in terms of industrialization and the adoption of new technologies. That can be most clearly seen from the fact that the empire still struggled with problems that other countries of Western Europe had largely overcome. A good example is a huge locust plague that happened in 1915. Swarms of locusts stripped areas around Palestine, Lebanon and Syria of almost all of their vegetation. Crops were ravaged and some regions had losses of up to 90%. That badly affected the already depleted food supply and led to widespread hunger. By December of 1915, the markets were empty and people had literally nothing to eat. One local diarist wrote, "I haven't seen darker days in all my life." The authorities were totally unable to deal with the problem. In Jerusalem, their solution was to force residents to collect 20 kilograms of locust eggs per week or face fines. That didn't work, and by 1916 there was a full-scale famine which killed up to 500,000 people.
Shit happens. That's my only response. Shit just happens. Yeah, natural disasters can just happen and mess everything up. What else do you want me to say here? Even when you are technologically advanced, stuff like this can literally just happen. I don't see why the Ottomans should be blamed here in this regard. Because, first of all, they were fighting a war with every able-bodied man at the front, and they were pouring a lot of resources into the war effort. I doubt they would have had enough spare hands and resources to handle the locust outbreak properly. Because you wanna know of another little thing that also managed to thrive and spiral out of control due to war conditions? The Spanish flu. Because if you are gonna point fingers at the Ottomans for not being able to handle the locust plague under war conditions, then I better see you pointing those same fingers at modern European nations for not being able to handle the Spanish flu. And secondly, I would argue Ottoman incapabilities of handling the plague was only one half of the pie that contributed to the devastating famine. The second one, which Mr. Henry completely leaves out, is the fact that the Ottoman Empire was completely blockaded by the Royal Navy, just like Germany. They had no ways of importing a single sack of food at all, even if they wanted to. And if the blockade of Germany managed to lead to 1 million people starving to death, despite Germany having relatively fertile lands with very up-to-date agricultural methods, what the hell do you think a blockade is gonna do to a nation like the Ottoman Empire, which was half desert? And I find it really strange that Mr. Slopwort would miss this crucial fact, because the book he has been so graciously referencing throughout the video, The Fall of the Ottomans by Eugene Rogan, literally talks about this, and that Enver Pasha got so desperate that he pleaded to the Pope to start a humanitarian mission and to convince the Entente to let the supplies through, even going as far as to promise that it would all go to civilians and not the soldiers. Unsurprisingly, this is war we are talking about, and there were no leeways in the blockade. If the blockade wasn't there, the famine would not have been as catastrophic as it was. This isn't something you can just squarely blame the Ottomans for.
Another good example of the empire being stuck in the past is how slow it had been to industrialize. That becomes clear if we look at these two tables. The first shows coal production of each country, while the second is the length of railway that each country had laid. As you can see, in both cases, the Ottomans were a long way away from the other nations. It had laid only about 10% as much railway as France or Germany, even though it was 5 times the size in terms of territory. That severely hampered the war effort, particularly logistics. The lack of railways and a road network that was mostly dirt tracks meant that moving troops and supplies was agonizingly slow. From Istanbul, it took over a month to reach Syria and nearly 2 months to reach Iraq. On the Caucasus front, one of the key fortresses was Erzurum, but the railway network didn't reach all the way there, so troops had a 35-day march to get there from the end of the line.
This is probably the most dishonest part of the video, like quite literally stripped completely of its context. Let me ask you a question. By the beginning of the 20th century, what was the most prosperous and economically vital region of the empire? It was the Balkan region. Regions like Thessaloniki or Rumelia, these were the most developed and industrialized parts of the Ottoman Empire. Most of their industrialization projects were concentrated there. What the Rhineland was to Germany, the Balkans was to the Ottomans. And you can see this if you take a look at the railway map of the empire from 1910. You have a railway that spans through Bulgaria, Greece, Macedonia, and Serbia, connecting all the important regional towns and cities in the region. But then, if you look at Anatolia, more than half of it wasn't connected by rail. That's because, dear children, Anatolia at the time was what we in the business referred to as a hole. The only economically important locations in that region were Ankara and Izmir. That was it, and they were already connected by railway. The other parts of Anatolia had more cattle than they had people. There was literally nothing there to incentivize the empire to build a railway. It just wasn't worth it. They would much rather invest into the region that was actually bringing in a ton of revenue. How much money can you possibly make connecting the Anatolian mountain village of Kakafirt to a railway? Hell, the 15 families living there probably never even heard of a train in their lifetime. And speaking of mountains, Anatolia is literally just fucking mountains, stretching kilometers and kilometers. So not only is there virtually no economic incentive to building a railway in those parts, the costs alone of building a rail line through those mountains would quite literally bankrupt the country. That is the reason precisely why the Ottomans weren't able to build the famous Berlin-Baghdad railway on their own and needed a big boy investor like the German Empire. So guess then what happened in 1912? The Balkan Wars, and the Ottomans completely lost control of those economically vital and developed Balkan provinces. All the money they had invested there has now vanished into thin air. And what was it left with? Shithole 1 and Shithole 2. So is it any surprise then that you check in on them only 2 years later in 1914 and see that it is barely industrialized? Try to picture this. You take Russia and then conquer all the land west of the Ural Mountains, leaving the Russians with only Siberia, and then a couple of years later you check in on them and then act shocked that Russia isn't as industrialized as other nations. This is basically what Henry Stewart is doing here. Again, the definition of ripping something straight out of its context. No wonder that the Ottomans weren't doing so well economically when just 2 years prior they had lost their most economically prosperous and developed regions.
The lack of industrialization also badly affected the Ottoman economy. Output per person in the Ottoman Empire was far lower than in industrial powerhouses like Britain or Germany. As a result, it could send a much smaller proportion of its men to fight. Over the course of the war, the Ottomans sent fewer than 3 million men to the front, or approximately 12% of their population. By comparison, Germany sent about 25% of its population.
So now we are comparing the Ottoman economy to the industrial juggernauts that are Britain and Germany? Are we being dead ass right now? Guys, I think I just discovered something revolutionary. Less industrialized nations have a much smaller output than advanced industrialized nations. Thank you. Please send in your votes to the Nobel Foundation for Economics down below.
Another issue with the lack of industrial output is that the Ottoman military didn't have all the equipment that it needed. Field guns and artillery were outdated, while machine guns were almost totally non-existent. Each regiment was supposed to have 4 machine guns, but in reality it was a long way off even that basic standard. There was also a crippling shortage of ammunition, medical supplies, and even transport animals. In fact, the Germans actually wrote about how bad the situation was. In June of 1915, the head of the German mission reported that he finally had enough troops on hand, but was experiencing difficulty with artillery ammunition availability, especially for his field howitzers.
Yes, the Ottomans had a shortage of military equipment. You wanna know who else suffered from a shortage of military equipment? The Russians, the French, the British, the Arabs, literally everyone. The Russians, for example, were suffering from a catastrophic shortage of ammunition in the Caucasus, and they were in a constant reinforcement battle to keep their divisions at full strength. For the British, meanwhile, operations in Mesopotamia were described as a, quote, logistical nightmare, and the army was critically short of river transports, while the port of Basra became a tight bottleneck where entire units were standing by for weeks waiting for their equipment to arrive. And the only reason the British stopped after the Palestine campaign was due to a strong lack of logistics. Everyone else, not just the Ottomans, were suffering from these issues. Again, this isn't fucking Hoi 4, where all your equipment in stockpile is magically teleported to your units when they lack it. The Ottoman front was a literal nightmare logistics-wise, and everyone else suffered as well. That's why in late 1914 and early 1915, Ottoman troops did not have winter clothes at the Russian front. Not because they just, I don't know, forgot or something, but because the infrastructure leading to the front lines was absolutely abysmal, and it would take literal months for military supplies to arrive. The Ottomans couldn't just wave a magic wand or something and suddenly build German highways across their entire nation. Erickson actually notes in his book on the Palestine campaign that the primary and main issue of the Ottoman army was a logistical one. Quote, "In fact, the weaknesses of the army were primarily logistical rather than weaknesses in command, doctrines, or training. As at Gallipoli, this was often misunderstood by its British opponent. As a result, in their planning processes, the British focused on the apparent weaknesses of the Ottoman army rather than focusing on how to overcome their enemy's demonstrated strengths. At Gallipoli, for example, the Ottomans didn't have as many logistical issues and were fully equipped. Plenty of food too, since the location suited them for supply reasons. So there, they were just chilling compared to other more distant fronts. And yet, despite these logistical nightmares, the Ottoman army still at times managed to pull off some good works, like transporting 20,000 men across the Sinai, which I mentioned earlier, as well as some really well planned out retreats. But the logistical issue was a problem for every side in the theater. Getting the equipment to the soldiers was the biggest issue, particularly when we are talking about the heavy kind like howitzers. People really do tend to sometimes underestimate the logistics of regularly supplying a front. All those shiny weapons you have in stockpile don't mean much if it's incredibly difficult to get them to your men.
I think those are probably the biggest reasons that the Ottomans performed so badly in the war. Something else worth mentioning is that when World War I broke out, the Ottoman Empire was already exhausted from having just fought 3 large wars. In 1911, it fought a war with Italy over control of Libya. The war became a grueling guerrilla conflict and cost the Ottomans about 20,000 men. Eventually, the Ottomans were defeated and forced to give up control of Libya. Then, in 1912 and 13, the Ottomans were involved in the Balkan Wars. They were a disaster and cost the lives of about 1 million Ottoman civilians and left 500,000 displaced. In total, those wars cost the Ottoman Empire about 1/3 of its territory and 1/5 of its population. They also badly depleted the Ottoman military and left the empire totally bankrupt.
I actually would disagree with that. In fact, I would even go as far as to say that had it not been for the Balkan Wars, the Ottoman military would have performed even worse during the First World War. That's because the Balkan Wars were, as Henry correctly pointed out, an absolute disaster, and the empire finally realized in what kind of dreadful state the military was, and began comprehensive reforms together with the German military mission. You can say all you want about Enver Pasha and the Armenian situation, but I would say he did a good job with the reforms. For example, over 1,000 older military officers were replaced with younger ones who had first-hand experience fighting against the Italians and the Balkan League, and the army standardized a triangular divisional structure that was later adopted by all the European powers. And by the eve of World War I, the army reforms were still undergoing and hadn't been completed yet, but a lot of good progress was made. Even at a tactical level, the Ottoman army remained a formidable fighting machine despite all the logistical hassles, and British intelligence reports early on in the war described Anatolian infantry divisions as being elite and even crack. Erickson notes in the conclusion that the Ottoman army was surprisingly durable. Quote, "The Turkish army displayed a remarkable ability to sustain itself under extremely adverse conditions. Furthermore, its soldiers proved resilient and capable of great feats of endurance. When allowed to dig in and entrench themselves, the army proved almost impossible to force out of its lines. The cost of defeating the Turkish army was usually high. The hard-fighting Askars needed very little of the service support that Western armies viewed as essential military requirements. As a result, the Turkish army was never quote-unquote top-heavy with support units and was able to put more soldiers into the front lines as a result. The army was also able to conduct offensive operations on a shoestring of support, and the marching capacity of the Turkish infantry was astounding. The Sherikamish, the Romanian, and the Azerbaijan campaigns stand out in this regard. Again, I am a firm believer in the fact that the Ottoman military suffered mainly from the logistical side of things, because, well, I think I already explained my position well, but I wouldn't say that is the only reason. Another big reason is, you probably saw this coming, Enver Pasha. Like, I genuinely tried to look and give any charity and benefit of the doubt I could, and I already did so with the army reform thing. But otherwise, this man has no redeeming qualities except for some pictures that evoke hard aura. And you know it's bad when it's coming from the mouth of the man who argued that Konrad von Hötzendorf wasn't a horrible general. He had very amateurish strategic visions when it came to operations, like the fact that the Sherikamish one almost worked with Napoleon tactics in the mountains and with no winter clothes is nothing short of a fucking miracle. I'd say that says more about the Russians than the Turks. And don't even get me started on the thing with the Armenians. Like, it was an objective fact that Armenian insurgents were doing a little trolling in the areas with Russian support. But from a tactical and strategic perspective, without going into demoralizing, it was retarded beyond scope and scale. There was no rational reason for him to go as hard on them as he did, and it strained the Ottomans even further both men and resource-wise, something that was completely avoidable if he just focused on counterinsurgency measures, but instead he chose the everyone and leave approach. I am fully convinced that if you put Enver Pasha's brain in a peanut shell and started rotating it for 1,000 years, the brain would never hit the sides. So now to conclude, considering that the objective of the Ottoman Empire was to distract Entente forces and have them send men and equipment to their theater, how much did their contribution in this regard help out the Central Powers, and did they succeed in that objective? If you ask me, yes. By entering the war, the Ottomans instantaneously created multiple secondary fronts that forced Great Britain and Russia to divert massive amounts of manpower and equipment away from the primary European theaters, and the Entente wasn't prepared to open up an Ottoman front, as I will quote Erickson here, quote, "Because of Turkey's geographic position, the relatively weak Turkish army became a magnet for Allied attacks, which saw decisive and cheap victory over the apparently ill-prepared and weak Turks. This drained deployable Allied strength, particularly much of Britain's available strategic reserves in 1915 and a substantial part of the Russian strategic reserve in 1916. No one in the Entente took the Ottomans very seriously. They thought that if they applied just enough pressure, they would collapse and sue for peace. But they severely underestimated just how durable the Ottomans were, even during their defeats. If the Ottomans sued for peace in like 1916 or early 1917, you could perhaps make the argument that it wasn't really worth it to bring the Ottomans in. But no, they lasted until late 1918 and buckled when other Central Powers nations buckled as well. They were a good team player here. I always say that when looking at a nation's performance, you need to judge them by what they had rather than what they could have had. Instead of trying to argue stuff like, oh, they should have had impeccable logistics and infrastructure like the Germans, no, you need to look at what they actually had and what they were dealing with. And for what the Ottomans had, just like the Austrians, they did better than anyone really expected. And it was very costly to engage the Ottomans in the first place for the Entente. For example, the British were so terrified of an Ottoman breakthrough in Egypt that they stationed and maintained an absolutely massive Egyptian expedition force totaling 200,000 troops. requiring 1.2 million gallons of water daily. And more than 2/3 of these guys never even saw fighting, they were just standing around for the worst case scenario. A modest expedition force of 50,000 or so could hold Egypt even in case of an Ottoman breakthrough. And those extra 150,000 and all those gallons of water would have been very handy somewhere else like the Western Front. I mean, just look at the Gallipoli numbers. 500,000 Entente soldiers were used for that operation, more than the total number of Entente soldiers fighting at either Verdun or Passchendaele. With those numbers, you could have had another big battle at the Western Front, but they instead went to the Turks, and in the end were beaten back. Like, I agree with Erickson, the Ottomans were a magnet for Allied attacks exactly because they seemed relatively weaker compared to the other Central Powers nations, and thought they were going in for an easy win. Of course, they did win in the end, but it was anything but an easy one. I do really think the Ottomans deserve some credit for holding out as long as they did and not making it easy for the Entente. They were the sick man of Europe, a sick lion so to say, but despite being put down in the end, the sick lion showed everyone it still had the ability to bite down hard. This one wasn't as big of a headache as the Austrian one. I most definitely expected much worse takes. So I guess even here we have something to praise Mr. Stewart for. If you want to learn more about the Ottoman army, Edward J. Erickson's works are an absolute must-read. From the Balkan Wars to the Great War, he goes into tremendous detail that other normal works don't tend to do. So if you are interested exclusively in the military stuff, Erickson is your go-to. If you are interested in both the military and the political situation, Sean McMeekin's Ottoman Endgame is also very useful and quite a balanced approach. Anyway, I wish all you chuddies a happy new year and we'll see you next time. Thanks to all the glorious people on Patreon who are supporting me in these endeavors. That really helps me out a lot. Anyway, bye-bye!